Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first of the workshops. Now, I will make you work quite hard. In the next workshop sessions, they're a little bit more relaxed, but like I say, there's going to be a quiz, so pay attention. My name's James Holmes. I actually don't work for HGCA. I work for HDC, which is the horticulture arm of AHDB, but for 6 years, I looked after the crop nutrient management program for HGCA. Recently moved to HDC about 4 weeks ago, so that's why I'm giving the presentation today. I now lead on resources for HDC, but you know that's actually not that important. What I want to talk to you today is about crop nutrient management, about use of nitrogen, sulfur, micronutrients, and you know, this is not to tell something you don't already know, but this is kind of the philosophy that we have at HGCA. So I consider myself to work for our levy payers. Now, that's farmers, but that's also processors and dealers who pay an HGCA levy, and that's an important consideration to remember. But we are the R&D department, so farmers and our levy payers, they come to us and they ask us questions, and each of those questions really is a legitimate question, and we think about how we can provide them with the information to answer that question. And I guess simply what we think is that farmers want to produce the highest yielding crop, the best quality, so that might be a barn filler, it might be a high quality milling wheat, but generally speaking it's the highest yielding crop and the best quality. They want to do that as efficiently as possible. They want to spend as less money, and I guess that's part of your job, convincing them that there's value in the products that you sell. But generally speaking, they'll want to do that as efficiently as possible. What they need to do, there's two things that they need to do, and it's really important when you're considering nutrient management. It's not just about the use of fertilizers. Actually, what they need to do first is create the best possible conditions for growth and the best possible conditions to enable those fertilizers to be used. So before you plan the use of nutrients, you think about the soil. We think about your soil type, your soil structure, its pH, and the availability that those nutrients will have to the crop. And that's really important. That's kind of our philosophy when we're thinking about anything that we do. We try to think about those four things. In terms of nutrient management, there's three aspects of there. There's soil physics, there's soil biology, and there's soil chemistry. And those, they're intricately linked, but they're also managed very differently when you consider what people are doing on farm. So in terms of soil physics, you have the soil type. You can rarely make any change to your soil type. It is what it is. But you can make a difference. You can improve soil organic matter. And as we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, you can have a negative impact on soil organic matter as well. You can have an influence on soil structure, around cultivations. Digging a hole, finding out what that structure is really important before you plan the use of nutrients. In terms of soil biology, we're thinking about the microflora that exists in the soil, the number of earthworms, the types of bacteria and fungi, because we've heard about all of the negative consequences of soil-borne disease this morning, but there's a lot of organisms in the soil that are working to your favour and that actually you want to encourage as well. And some of the products that we're using are going to have an effect on those populations, and that's worth considering. Traditionally that will all be managed through a rotation. We're seeing much more attention being paid to that recently, as where we just can't reach for something out of the can to solve the problems. We're considering how we can make better use of the rotation. That's really important. And then in terms of soil chemistry, thinking about pH, is the pH right? Without the right pH, and the nutrients you apply are just simply not going to be available. The nutrients that are in the soil are simply not going to be available. So you may have a deficiency or suspect you have a deficiency in the crop, but that might be not because there are inadequate levels in the soil. It might be just that they're not available. So pH is really incredibly important, but often overlooked. And that's before, so get pH right before you consider using an organic manure, biosolids, green manure, whatever that is, and certainly before you apply a fertiliser. And then, integral to that is soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is going to help the water infiltrate into soil. It's also going to help the soil retain soil. But quite often, it won't be nitrogen that limits yield. It'll be the availability of water. The soil organic matter, is an important consideration in nutrient management, and is something that you really need to get right. In terms of information on crop nutrient management, there's a whole range of of resources available to you. The fertilizer manual is, for me, it's the starting block. It's that source of information, really incredibly valuable information. People will criticise RB209. Some parts of it are out of date. Some pieces do need to be updated. But as a first port of call, RB209 is the place to go. You can download it from it's not DEFRA's website now. I think it's on gov.uk. It forms the basis of the FACS syllabus. So if you're thinking about taking your FACS qualification, if you have taken your FACS qualification, you will have been taught RB209, you're examined on RB209, and then you'll be re-examined on RB209 as well. It's an incredibly useful source of information, but it's not the end of the story. And this is really where AHDB and each of the sectors come into their own. Each of us produce a whole range of different information that supports the information in the fertiliser manual. So there were 10 years between the previous two revisions of RB209, between the 7th and the 8th edition. There's quite a lot of information, and practices do change quite a bit between revisions of RB209. But what AHDB does is kind of plug that gap. So we produce a whole range of information on the use of nitrogen, sulfur, micronutrients, and then provide more detailed information on how crops, basic physiology, how crops develop, how much nitrogen, for example, you might expect a crop to have taken up during its development. And then, beyond that, there are a whole series of tools that you can create or use to create nutrient management plans, because at the end of the day, these are just sources of information. They're not actually that useful. What farmers and what agronomists like yourselves want to do is create nutrient management plans, as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and for people to follow those out on farm. All of this information is really important, but what we also do at AHDB is provide the tools for you, templates essentially, to create nutrient management plans. Planet is not necessarily the most user-friendly piece of software. It can take a great deal of time to get used to that. But what's really important to remember about Planet is that the calculation engine, all of the calculations, and that information is coming from RB209, but all of the calculations that Planet is making when you tell it you want to sow a winter wheat crop on this type of soil in that part of the country, all of that information you can use in Planet, but is also used by Gatekeeper and Farm Aid. So they'll take the information that's contained in Planet and put a different face on it. So don't dismiss Planet or RB209 simply because you're using another perhaps more commercial piece of software. A lot of the information from RB209 and a lot of the programming work that goes into Planet is then used by commercial companies as well, and that's really important to remember. AHDB also funded the development and release of another piece of software recently, and how many of you are advising on farms that are using manures, biosolids, mucks of any type? So not many. Perhaps a little bit more actually. It's not necessarily typical, certainly in the east of the country, but if you are, have a look at our website and download a copy of Manna. It's a really simple tool. You're saying, I'm going to use this type of muck on this type of soil at this time of year, and it will give you the nutrient content, and that you can use to supplement the information in your nutrient management plan. And in terms of what HGCA does, and practices do change. The example I always use is of beetroot. Certainly coming from a horticultural perspective now. In the past, we've produced these large beets that you've boiled in a pan till they're almost dead. That's how we as kids used to eat beetroot as well. Your mum would chop it up and put it in a salad. But now that's not what really growers are producing. They're producing small beets for red beets for pre-packed salads. And the fertilizer requirements of those two crops are very different. So practices do change. And that's kind of it's a change in practice that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. So things do change, and we need to adapt, and we need to trial fertilizer under these different kind of production methods. But what we do is we fund research. On one side of the business, we're producing research. And essentially that's trials. So what is the fertilizer requirement of this tiny little salad beet versus a huge monster? But again, that's a source of information. It's arguably used to man or dog. what's really important is that we're able to communicate that, and that's something that we take quite a lot of pride in. We think that we do really well at AHDB. We produce a whole range of guidance based on the trials that we've done, and you've seen a lot of examples of that this morning. And we do very similar things across a whole range of subjects, including crop nutrition. And we produce this guidance. You know, ultimately, our aim is to inform revisions of RB209. But then that information there supports development of tools like Planet, which it then extends into Gatekeeper and Manor MPK. And the ultimate goal is that this information that we've produced in trials funded by our research programs, you know, essentially informs how you or farmers can create nutrient management plans. So if I'll just park that for 1 minute and then consider what HGCA does above and beyond, say, what's in RB209, and I'll focus on 3 different things this afternoon. I'm going to talk more about our nitrogen guide, which is you know, goes above and beyond the information in RB209. I'll talk about the information that we've produced on sulfur over the last couple of years, and the trials that we've done on micronutrients as well, which is you know, is always very topical. So our nitrogen guide, like I said, it's above and beyond the information that's in RB209. You've each got a copy of that now that you can take away with you. What that guide does is it works through all of the steps that you consider when applying nitrogen from marketing. So from when one of your clients selects the crop they want to grow, which I think is, you know, is typically what happens, then they ask you, you know, how can they best grow that. You know, from that decision about what it is they're going to grow, right through to, you know, how you might monitor the success of that nitrogen program to inform how much nitrogen you might use next time that crop is grown, or, you know, even the next crop in the rotation as well. You know, the concept is that the crop has a demand for nitrogen. You know, when you produce X number of tons, it's going to require X number of kilograms of nitrogen. That will be met, you know, in 2 different ways. It will be met from a supply from the soil, so, you know, the soil would inherently contain an amount of nitrogen, be that large or small, and then what you're doing as an agronomist is kind of filling in the gap. So there's a demand that the crop has that will be met in part from the soil. You then apply either a manure or a fertilizer to meet that gap in demand. And what the nitrogen guide does is it takes you through that step by step. So it's my pop quiz. So the first time I've done this, I hope it's going to be really smooth. By the time I've done this for the 3rd time, I suspect it will be. The ultimate aim is that you calculate the nitrogen requirement for a crop. And so the question I pose to you is, what is the nitrogen requirement for this bread-making wheat grown on a light sandy soil with an expected yield of 8 tonnes a hectare? So in front of you, you have the nitrogen guide. And just put that to the side for 1 minute. But you also have a sheet. So both of these are available on the website. So if you want electronic versions, Google, I suggest you do that because it's slightly easier to navigate on our own website. But if you Google HGCA nitrogen guide, it will bring you to this page where you can download that. You can also download this kind of pro forma as well. And so they're available side by side. And then if we just go through each of the lines, so each of the lines is labelled here. So we have A, which corresponds to the first row in the sheet. So you have an example there. You know, I'm giving you some information here to make this exercise slightly easier, but it's a bread-making wheat grown on a light sandy soil, and we're expecting 8 tonnes. So if you've got a pen, and everybody should have a pen on the table, write 8 tonnes in that first row next to the previous example, which is 9.8 tonnes. The next row is the crop N content. So this is basically how essentially we start to calculate the crop nitrogen demand. And I'm asking you now to look in the book and tell me what is the crop N content, and that's on table 2, page 7. If you all turn to page 7, and table 2, which is at the top of the page, I've given you some information about the crop, which should mean you will be able to tell me the number of kilograms per tonne that we expect for this crop. Is anybody bold enough to put their hand up and tell me how much that is? 25. Perfect. Excellent. So in the next row, we put the number 25. Now, for the purposes of simplicity, I've given you the next value for the third row, which is C. The value for that is 0. So we're not going to adjust for the effects of price, either the effect of a low grain price, perhaps like we have at the moment, or a high price of fertiliser. If you are producing grain for a very low price, you can therefore afford to spend less on fertiliser. And so there's a table in the guide that allows you to make that adjustment. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're not going to make an adjustment. So the row C is 0. And then you can see what happens. So then we can calculate the crop end demand. So this is the amount of nitrogen that the crop requires. And you calculate that by multiplying the number of tonnes by the crop N content to give you the crop nitrogen demand. Has anybody else been able to make that calculation? 200 kilos, brilliant. So I apologise. One of the things that I wanted to do is ask at the beginning is how many of you are facts qualified? Because I was going to modify the strategy if everybody put up their hand, but how many are people who are facts qualified in this room? Okay, so it's about maybe 1/3. So this is a really good example of the type of work that you'll do in your facts exam. You'll be using typically RB209, but you'll be doing very similar things. You'll spend days doing exercises like this. So this is why I wanted to go through this, because it's the type of thing that you will be doing in the future. I'm really pleased that you're not all facts qualified and that I'm just kind of teaching people to suck eggs. That would have been embarrassing. So we've calculated the crop N demand. So if I just went back, that is this value here. So that's the amount of nitrogen we want to supply to the crop. But what's important is to consider how much nitrogen is going to be supplied by the soil. And so the next couple of lines are all about that. So what is the crop N, so the amount of nitrogen that's in the crop when the soil is sampled? And so this is row E, and I give you some information to be able to make an estimate of this. So the green area index at this time was 0.5, and you'll be able to estimate the crop N content on page 9 in table 7. So is anybody able to tell me what the crop N content, kilos per hectare, would be for a crop of GA 0.5? 15 kilos. So in row E, we put 15. Now, again, for the purposes of simplicity, I'm telling you how much soil mineral nitrogen there was. So if you had decided to take a soil sample, min-N or whatever that was, you would be able to calculate the amount of nitrogen that was in the soil, and that's known as soil mineral nitrogen. So in row F, if you put 50 kilos, that's the amount of nitrogen we expect to be in the soil. The next row, G, is the amount that we might expect to be mineralised over the remaining of the season. So what we've done here in E is calculate. No one saw that today. No. What we've done in E is calculate how much nitrogen was already in the crop, at that time in the season. What you've done in F is calculate how much is in the soil. Another important part of the calculation is how much will become available. So nitrogen, the levels of nitrogen in the soil is fairly dynamic. You've heard that word. It's a bit of a buzzword, but basically what that means is it can change. Nitrogen can be locked up or it can be released, and considering how much is released is an important part of this calculation. Again, for the purpose of simplicity, I've just said that that's 0, but that could be, say, in a mild winter and a warm spring, you might expect there to be a greater level of mineralisation because all of the bugs and the beasties in the soil are working hard. They've not had this kind of hibernation period over the winter, and so mineralisation might be higher in those circumstances. But for the purposes of this exercise, that's 0 in G. So that means what we can calculate is the soil end supply. So that's this part of the equation here. We've already calculated what the crop needs. Here now we've enabled ourselves to calculate what is going to be supplied by the soil. So you do that by adding 15 plus 50 plus 0 gives you a value of 65. Look at that. That's amazing. So, right. So what we then do is calculate the crop end shortfall. So this is the gap. This is the gap that you want to fill by applying either a manure or a fertiliser. And that's a fairly simple calculation, having worked out the previous two. So that's 200 minus 65 plus 20. Because there is an amount of nitrogen, we say it's 20 kilos, that is essentially deposited on the ground. So we always take off an extra 20 because there's a little bit of nitrogen that's basically going to settle on the ground and the crop's going to be able to use. So 200 minus 85 equals 115. So that's our shortfall. That's what we want to supply to the crop. But that's not the end of the story, because what we apply won't be used at 100% efficiency. So we can't simply apply 115 kilos. This will be music to your ears. But and this is totally dependent on the type of soil that you're growing your crop on. So to calculate your fertiliser, or to estimate your fertiliser efficiency, we need to go to section J on page 11. So using the information that I gave you at the beginning, can anybody tell me, from just quickly browsing through section J, what we might expect the fertiliser efficiency to be for this particular soil type? 70%, exactly. So what does that mean? 70%. Basically, that means that we only expect 70% of the fertiliser to be used. So we need to adjust the amount that we apply, i.e. more than 115, to take account of the fact that we're only going to get 70% efficiency. So this is helped greatly by the fact that you should all have a phone, because if you're anything like me, you won't be able to do this in your head. We need to calculate how much fertiliser we're going to apply to the crop. And again, if any of you are going to be doing the FACS qualification, this is exactly the type of thing that you're going to be asked to do, fairly regularly. You'll become so bored of this, you'll think, the first time was just amazing. But the first step is to calculate the ratio, if you like. So you know that the fertiliser recovery is 70, so if you have a phone, what you need to do is divide 100 by 70, which gives you a ratio. Does anybody have a phone and is able to make that calculation? 100 divided by 70. There we go, so 1.43. Now, the second step of this calculation, and there's a million one ways to skin a cat, but this is, I think perhaps the most simplest way, certainly when you're relying on people to have smartphones and do it quite quickly. The second step is to times the shortfall, so 115 kilos a hectare, by that ratio, 1.43, to give you the answer, the nitrogen requirement for this crop, which is 164 kilos a hectare. So I hope that wasn't too tedious. I apologise if it was. But it's a really good example of the type of work that you'll be doing, really, on a day-to-day basis to a certain extent. Certainly when you take your FACS exam, this is the type of stuff that they're gonna get you do fairly routinely. This is fairly straightforward. They're going to throw a lot of different types of things at you, do lots of different scenarios. But I hope it gives you a kind of a flavour for our nitrogen guide, because you really don't get that in RB209. You get some basic information about nitrogen requirement, how you might best apply that, but the nitrogen guide that we supply goes, one step further and takes you through that whole process step by step. And I think it's really valuable, and I hope you can, you can see why. So, if we're thinking again about how HGCA, provides information above and beyond what's in RB209, there's some information in RB209 about how you might calculate the soil nitrogen supply. So what the soil is going to supply in terms of nitrogen. And we've done a lot of research on this over, the last 4 years. And, really the message is quite simple. Again, this is not in RB209, but if you expect the soil nitrogen supply to be small, we don't believe that there's very much value in actually measuring that. So not only can it be very time consuming, but very costly to measure soil mineral nitrogen. If you believe it's likely to be small, below 120 kilos a hectare, it's really not, we don't believe, worth your while measuring that. And that simply estimating it using a field assessment method, essentially using RB209, is a more cost-effective approach. And if you want to read more about that, certainly when you come to facts, if you want to read more about that, go to our website and download topic sheet 115. Sulfur is really interesting because 30 years ago, not many people were applying sulfur, but it's actually really incredibly important now, and you shouldn't be growing oilseed rape without sulfur. We know from the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice that people are growing sulfur, or at least they tell DEFRA they're growing oilseed rape without using sulfur. That's really madness. You shouldn't be growing oilseed rape without using sulfur. But it's not quite as straightforward for cereals, which have a lower requirement of sulfur. But it is fair to say that emissions of sulfur dioxide have reduced massively over the last 40 years. And this is why it's becoming more important, because we're not simply able to rely on the amount of sulfur that just is emitted by power stations and falls really nicely and neatly on our land. We're not able to rely on that anymore because they've cleaned up their act, and there's not so much sulfur being emitted into the atmosphere, so there's not as much falling onto the ground. So people are increasingly needing to apply sulfur, and there's a risk assessment, kind of an exercise that you go through to determine whether or not you need to apply that for a cereal. But what we've done recently as well, we've shown this really clear link between the use of sulfur and acrylamide formation. So you may or may not have heard of acrylamide, but basically simply what that is, it's a processing contaminant. When you use wheat to produce something like a pasty, for example, and it's baked, you can get the formation of a compound called acrylamide. Acrylamide is carcinogenic, and it's been in the media quite a lot recently, certainly around the production of potatoes, but also for cereal products as well. And it's a really important concern for processors, HGCA's levy payers, that we provide the best possible conditions that we don't get formation of acrylamide. And we've shown this really clear link between the use of sulfur and acrylamide formation. So where sulfur is necessary, you should really be using that top dose, 50 kilos a hectare on cereals, because it minimises very clearly the formation of acrylamide in baked products. I think that's really good advice to be given to your clients. If you believe that sulfur should be used, don't mess around. Go at that full rate of 50 kilos a hectare. And again, if you'd like more information on that, there's more than I can tell you now. Go to our website and download information sheet 28. Micronutrients, quite an emotive subject. We get asked a lot of questions about micronutrients from, particularly our farmer levy payers, because they're being told to use them. To be quite frank, agronomists are recommending the use of micronutrients, but they're unsure if there's value in that. Largely speaking, they're not dismissing them, but they want to have confidence that what they're paying for is valuable. And so we've done, and this is a good example of how our trials work. A lot of people think that our trials are run on university farms with very little relevance to UK agriculture. In fact, what we did for micronutrients is run 5 trials a year over a 3-year period from 2009 to 2012 on 10 different sites, 6 trials on light soils, 6 trials on organic soils, and 3 trials on a calcareous soil. So these are soil types where you would expect to see micronutrient deficiencies. These were all commercial farms. They were farms selected because they routinely saw micronutrient deficiencies. And that's an important point to remember when you consider HGCA research. It's not all done on irrelevant university farms. A lot of our research is done on commercial farms. So this is a quick summary of those results. So we have the 5 organic soils here, Bardney, Ely, Pricklow, Strettenham and Waterbeach. the 4 sites that were light soils and the 1 site of calcareous soils. And what each of these columns is it's telling you, you know, when we took a soil sample and analysed that, so you went through the field following that double W pattern that everybody does, taking a sample from each, sticking that in a bucket, putting that in a bag and sending it to the lab. We only saw results that were below published thresholds, you know, and I admit they're not always clear, and different companies, certainly different labs will have different thresholds, but we use a standard set in these experiments that were, you know, fairly low actually, I think, in the grand scheme of things, to really highlight where potentially micronutrients were deficient. And we only saw, of all of those organic soils, we only saw an analysis that was below the threshold for copper in 2012. We saw a couple more on the calcareous soil, so copper was below the threshold in 2010, 11 and 12, but in terms of the light soils, we only saw in soil samples levels of copper and zinc that were below the thresholds at Morley in 2010. So of potentially 45 results, we only saw, you know, levels below the threshold in a handful of sites. Again, that's one way that you can diagnose a deficiency. The second is to be able to measure the amounts in the plant, in the crop. This is a snapshot because it's really only true on the day that you took that sample, but it's a good indication. And, you know, I'd always say do both. You know, if you suspect you have a deficiency, take soil and tissue analysis. Take soil really quite early in the season, in fact, you know, around harvest. Take your soil samples there, because then you've got more time. You know, you could arguably after that you could apply a seed treatment. You can certainly treat manganese deficiencies in the autumn as well. If you leave it until the spring when it's really going to show in the crop, well, a lot of damage could already have been done, but you have less options as well. But leaf analysis in the spring is a good indication of a deficiency, you know, albeit, you know, a snapshot in time. And we saw many more levels of micronutrients below the threshold in that leaf analysis. But what's really important is that when we applied fertiliser, and we applied micronutrient fertiliser to all of these trials, we only saw 2 responses, crop responses. So they only positively responded to these applications of micronutrient fertiliser on 2 occasions. And that was one to a copper treatment in 2012 and to zinc in 2010. What's really important to note is the size of these responses, which probably took everybody by surprise. So, you know, if you have a deficiency, you know, and I'm not for 1 minute dismissing this, you know, it is a serious issue, and there is definitely a place for micronutrients in a nutrient management program. But clearly it's not going to be every year on every soil type. That's something that you need to manage as agronomists, because you need to take a risk-based approach to that. So I'm not suggesting that on some of these sites you wouldn't apply it each year. You might not necessarily expect to see a response every year, but that's a, you know, a risk-based approach that you or your company might take. But in these trials, I think, you know, the key message for me is that there is a place for micronutrients, but it's not going to be each year on every soil type. But the response can be large, so don't dismiss them, because it can be an important part in the nutrient management program. We also did a separate piece of work to support the work that we were doing on UK farms. That was a desk study. We looked at approximately 400 crop response experiments from around the world, published and unpublished data that people made available to us from around the world, but in kind of situations similar to the UK. So we're talking about North America, New Zealand, similar types of growing conditions and similar types of climate. And what we found there to support the results that we have from UK farms is statistically significant yield responses to copper, manganese and zinc for cereals. So beyond the trials that we've done in the UK, I think we can be quite confident in telling our levy payer, our farmer levy payers, that you can, you know, reasonably expect to see responses from the use of copper, manganese and zinc micronutrient fertilisers in the UK, and for boron and for molybdenum on oilseed rape. So we don't necessarily have the trial data from the UK, but we have it from very similar types of situations from the rest of the world. Is that for me? I think maybe I'm running out of time. I'll just wait. Postpone. So that's a really important message. You know, there clearly is a place for micronutrients, you know, and I've been misquoted on that in the media in the past. There clearly is a place for micronutrients in the programme, but be sensible about how you advise their use, because it won't be each year for every crop, but just be sensible about how you advise on that and how you describe their use to your clients based on essentially risk management. The key message is that, you know, many soils contain sufficient amounts of micronutrients, but deficiencies do occur. And again, coming back to my message at the beginning, if your pH isn't right, you're not going to be able to use those elements, be it micronutrients and nitrogen or phosphate. If your pH ain't right, those nutrients aren't going to be available. So the soil might contain, you know, adequate levels, and that would you wouldn't see that then in a soil sample. But if your pH ain't right, you're not going to be able to use those. The crop's not going to be able to use those. So it's really incredibly important to get the pH right. But then if you suspect a deficiency and collect soil samples, do that as early as possible in the season because it gives you more options, and then collect tissue analysis in the spring as well, and that will give you, collectively that will give you a lot of information, and you'll be much better informed and be able to talk to your clients about the risks involved. Again, if you would like more information on that, that's HGCA information sheet 25, and you can download that from your website. And again, this is all above and beyond what's in RB209. Eventually this will inform revisions of RB209, and hopefully as an industry we'll get better about making more regular revisions of RB209. That's a great passion of mine, but at the moment we provide this information as kind of a supplement, so it's really important to go and search this out as well. In terms of other ongoing research, I can't tell you the results of this at the moment. We have a huge program within HGCA and AHDB. We've got some really interesting work on-farm tramline trials. So this is about how you might measure the success of your nitrogen program. Essentially where you as an agronomist can work with one of your clients to run a strip where they apply the regular amount of nitrogen, what they always would have applied, what you've advised them to apply, and then a protocol for how you might run a strip beside that that's 60 kilos less and 60 kilos more, and you can see, is that recommendation that's based on national guidance actually appropriate for this farm or for this field, and you can start to build up more information about that. And that's really interesting. It's not quite as straightforward as you might imagine, and we're going to provide we hope we're going to be able to provide a protocol and a description of how you might be able to do that kind of statistical analysis to come up with a really robust recommendation that would stand up to Environment Agency scrutiny, perhaps. We're looking at those measures of success. So how do you know how successful you've been? You can measure grain N content, various different things, but we're not as an industry particularly sure about how accurate they are, and we're looking at all of those. We have a whole program of trials on winter barley. Nobody really in the industry has done a comprehensive program like this in the past. We're working with Grow How and Syngenta to trial a whole range of modern barley varieties, and that's going to be really interesting work because that hasn't been done for about 30 years. We're looking at critical levels of phosphate because it'll become clear when you're doing your FATS course that you've got very generic advice. There's simplicity in that, but in terms of RB209, the advice really is for all soil types. This is how much phosphate you should apply, and that's irrespective of soil type. And there's a lot of evidence. We have a lot of evidence that's not right for every soil type as well. So we're taking that work forward. We're looking at novel ways to apply phosphate. That might be using a product like Avail. It might be a placement. It might be a novel type of fertilizer like Struvite, which is a byproduct of the wastewater industry. It's a concentrated magnesium phosphate fertilizer. So we're trialing these other kind of innovative ways to be able to apply phosphate to crops. We're looking at sulfur requirement of oilseed rape as well. There's a lot of people that don't believe that the recommendation in RB209 is high enough. So again, we're looking at that, and then looking at the sulfur supply from organic manures. So in RB209, and I love RB209, it's a really great document, but if you look through that, it will tell you the nitrogen content and availability from pig slurry, and it will tell you the phosphate, total phosphate content and the phosphate availability from that pig slurry, but it will only tell you the sulfur, total sulfur content. It won't tell you the availability. So when you create nutrient management plan or when you use manna, what you don't know is how much of that sulfur in that pig slurry is actually going to be available to the next crop. So we're looking at that. So we have some very grand plans to run nitrogen strip trials on farm, and we have some, perhaps arguably less significant, but I think just as important trials to better understand the sulfur supply from organic manures. That's all upcoming work. That will become, each of these projects will kind of mature and come to an end over the next 4 or 5 years, and as we do that, that will be made available through events and guides. I really encourage you to keep in contact with HGCA. If you don't get emails, then sign up today and come to future events. I mean, not least you can get basis and points to keep up your CPD, but you'll also get the results of this information as well. I talked about what HGCA provides. Strictly speaking, this is an HGCA event, but I work for HDC now, and I won't say too much about this, but so suffice to say that HDC produced information very similar to HGCA. It's a different type of industry, a much shorter supply chain, but we're producing information, for example, on nitrogen recommendations for baby leaf salad. Different crops, very similar types of trials, and very similar ways that we're supplementing RB209. And each of these guides, if you're interested, is available at the back of the room on the table there. Potato Council as well. As are Jim got really excited. Jim works for Potato Council then. Potato Council producing some really, really great information that supplements, again, RB209. Crop nutrition for potatoes, soil management for potatoes, both available at the end of the room. Key messages for me, RB209 is an excellent guide. Don't dismiss it. It really is a great source of information, and it will get better. It's built on by AHDB sector-specific guidance. So again, search out what we have, because that all builds on RB209, provides you with more information. Our publication's available online and hard copy at events. Download Manna if you're using organic manures. I think you'll find that really simple to use, and it's really, very neat. And then, attend our events. You'll find out, really quickly about the results of our research and be able to collect CPD points. If you have any more questions, then please feel free to call me or drop me a line. I'm more than happy to talk to you about anything that I've discussed today. Thank you very much.